In the last blog, I talked about the state of the industry and where we're at now, and I touched a bit on where things could be going for the future, but I'd like to elaborate more on that. Firstly, I think, well, hopefully, the barrier for entry in terms of game development, in terms of the tools and the technology and the knowledge that it takes to develop a game, will hopefully keep decreasing. And certainly that's been a trend. If you look at what it took to create a Nintendo game back in the 80s, it was hand-coded and assembly, and you had to have intricate knowledge of the processor in the console. But now if you look at something like a Game Maker or a lot of these tools, or Flash even, you can create a similar style game with a ton less work and a ton less technical knowledge. And ideally I'd like to see, but I think that trend is going to keep being true. And if you look at things like Project Spark or Little Big Planet or even Minecraft, there are ways to create content, to create games that are simpler and in ways that a kid could do. And I think a large part of them is they're having the computer solve some tricky problems for you. And I think potentially that could be true across a lot of disciplines of game development. Like I mentioned object scanning in the state of the industry blog, but what about animation? I think motion capture is one thing, but what about procedural animations? If you look at Spore, I mean, the procedural animation from a technical standpoint in that game was amazing. It was far from perfect, but the thing that was so amazing about Spore is that for most characters, except for, well, I like trying to break systems, so I made some that just looked awful animated. But I mean, for most characters, most sane characters that people would want to create or see in a game, it came up with animations for them. They weren't maybe the greatest animations in the world, but it was something. So imagine you create a monster in a game and the game can animate it for you. Or potentially maybe use like Connect to act out part of the animation, or you can you do some sort of marionette or Muppet control, or like they do for Red versus Blue, and you actually play the character to define the animations. And this would really simplify the act of creating content for games, and I think to some extent we have some of the technology available. Certainly Spore is very limited, it only does Spore characters, but I think moving forward potentially these tools could become more general purpose or applied to different things. And I mean, you know, certainly Spore as a game maybe wasn't the best game in the world, but it was very cool in terms of the content you could create. And I think to some extent well, everything is limited by the amount of processor you have, by the amount of computing you can do. And so as Moore's Law continues to rise exponentially, I think we're going to get more possibilities and more tools, and things that were difficult before may become easier. And I mean, obviously I'm speaking a long way out. I don't think we're at a point where we could say, you know, here's a human character, model his animation believably based on muscle constraints and you know, rotation. I mean, certainly we have ragdolls, but usually those aren't very realistic. You know, they're very ragdoll-y. but imagine if we had a physical model of a human character with all the forces and constraints and some idea of the natural movements. Imagine then if we could, apply that to a game character. And I mean, if you look at a top AAA, some games I think have over like 1,000 player animations. So someone has to create or motion capture 1,000 different movements for this character. And so if you could have a library of those, or a character that's sort of pre-programmed to behave in certain ways, I think that would really simplify content creation. So that's just my vision of the future, hopefully. Hopefully it'll come true, because I think the more people making games, the better games as an art form will be.